They thought a surgeon couldn't fight back until she cut through their lies. Emma's boots crunched against the gravel path leading to the Silver Stream Reserve, the autumn wind tugging at the collar of her jacket. Every gust carried with it the scent of pine and damp earth, a stark contrast to the concrete smell of Chicago hospitals where she had spent the last decade navigating emergencies and sterile routines. The inheritance of her father's reserve had seemed, at first, like a quiet retreat, a chance to step away from endless pressure. But now, standing before the crumbling visitor center and the overgrown trails, Emma felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her chest. She inhaled sharply, scanning the landscape. The mountains rose like silent guardians, their peaks brushing the clouds, and the river that wound through the valley shimmered under the fading sunlight. This was her new life, or perhaps the life that would test every skill she had ever learned. As a trauma surgeon, she was trained to think quickly, to adapt, to act decisively under pressure, but the pressures here were different. Financial ruin, the delicate ecosystem of the reserve, and the people who called this place home were variables she had never faced before. It was during her first inspection of the Western Ridge that she met him, Dave. He was crouched near a fallen oak, adjusting the harness of a young eagle that had tangled itself in fencing wire. His movements were careful, almost reverent, a stark contrast to the swift decisiveness she was used to in operating rooms. When he noticed her watching, his dark eyes met hers, and he straightened with a polite, reserved nod. "I'm Emma," she said, extending a hand, though she immediately regretted the formality. Out here, handshakes felt awkward, almost unnecessary. "Dave," he replied, voice steady, calm, carrying a hint of amusement at her stiffness. "Welcome to Silver Stream." The first spark between them was subtle but undeniable, a quiet recognition that they were both outsiders trying to navigate a world they only partially understood. Emma's logical mind cataloged him, risk-taker, deeply connected to the land, protective of the community. Dave's gaze lingered on her with curiosity and caution, as if assessing whether she would survive or whether she would crumble under the weight of her inheritance. Their conversation was interrupted by the distant roar of a helicopter descending into the clearing. Emma squinted against the fading sun and saw the sleek black aircraft settle near the riverbank. Her stomach tightened. Corporate business rarely came unannounced, and the timing was suspicious. A tall man in a crisp suit disembarked, his movements deliberate and precise. Julian. She recognized him immediately, not as a past lover, though the fleeting memory of him once haunting her Chicago years stirred faintly, but as the representative of the corporation that had been eyeing her father's debts for months. Julian's approach was measured, his smile polite but cold. "Emma," he said, extending a hand that was firm but unyielding. "I hope I'm not intruding. I'm here on official business regarding Silver Stream." Emma felt the first real twinge of conflict. Dave had instinctively stepped a fraction closer to her, as if shielding her from the sudden tension that radiated from Julian. She forced herself to smile, but the tightness in her chest betrayed her. This was more than a meeting. It was the collision of worlds. Her methodical, calculated existence was suddenly entwined with the intuitive, free-flowing life of Silver Stream and the unrelenting corporate pressures represented by Julian. As they toured the reserve, Julian's eyes scanned every corner with a scrutinizing sharpness that made Emma uncomfortable. "There are outstanding loans tied to this property," he said, voice smooth, almost conversational, yet each word carried the weight of threat. Without intervention, the land could be repossessed. He glanced at Dave with a faintly amused expression, though his intent was unmistakable. The pilot, protector of this wilderness, was an obstacle he intended to manipulate. Emma's mind raced, cataloging possibilities. She could rely on logic and negotiations, or she could start building alliances with the community that Dave had effortlessly embedded himself within. Already, stakes were high. Her father's legacy, the future of the reserve, and perhaps her own heart hung in precarious balance. As dusk settled, painting the mountains in shades of amber and violet, Emma realized that nothing here was simple. Trust would have to be earned, alliances tested, and somewhere between the rational strategies she relied upon and the instinctive courage that Dave embodied, she would need to find the path that preserved both the land and her own integrity. The first seeds of challenge and of possibility were sown. The morning air was sharp, and Emma wasted no time in the office. She spent the first hours of daylight physically marking the boundaries of the most vulnerable sections of the reserve, hammering wooden stakes into the soft earth near the western ridge. Every strike of the mallet felt like a rejection of Julian's claims. She was no longer just observing. She was claiming space. Beside her, Dave recorded the GPS coordinates of each marker, his movements methodical and quiet, matching her professional intensity with a focused silence of his own. Yet the unease remained, a quiet drumbeat under her ribs. Dave had offered to guide her through the more dangerous paths of the reserve, showing her how to assess the health of the land, how to read animal tracks, and how to check the water levels of the stream. Emma observed him with admiration. His knowledge was intuitive, almost instinctual, and every gesture carried authority without arrogance. "Why do you care so much about this place?" she asked, breaking a silence that had stretched long enough to become comforting. Dave looked up from examining a moss-covered rock, brushing soil from his hands. "Because it's more than land," he said softly. "It's history. It's life. And if someone like Julian takes over, it's gone in a heartbeat. People forget that money isn't everything." Emma nodded, impressed by his conviction, but a small voice in the back of her mind whispered caution. She knew better than to trust appearances alone. Yet something about Dave's calm steadiness pulled at the part of her that had grown weary of the rigid, controlled environment of Chicago hospitals. The trap revealed itself sooner than she expected. Later that day, as she sorted through paperwork in the reserve office, a casual comment from Julian over the phone sent a jolt through her. "I noticed Dave's old contracts from his time with Terranex Mining," Julian said smoothly, almost innocuously. "It's fascinating how thorough he was, helping them locate potential drilling sites, isn't it?" Emma froze, the paper she had been holding trembling slightly in her fingers. Her mind raced. Terranex was notorious for environmental damage, and any connection between Dave and that company could undermine not only his credibility, but the trust of the local community he had worked to protect. When she confronted Dave later, he met her in the clearing where the young eagle had been released days before. The sunlight caught the strands of his hair, and his eyes reflected both concern and something harder to read. "Emma, he began, but she cut him off, her voice sharp with the precision of a surgeon finding a secondary wound. "Julian has the Terranex contracts, Dave. He showed me the survey maps you signed." Dave's expression didn't soften into a plea for forgiveness. Instead, his jaw set in a hard, defiant line. He didn't reach for her. "I'm not going to stand here and litigate a decade-old job to prove I'm a good man, Emma. If the work I've done for this reserve and the animals since I arrived isn't enough for you to see who I am, then no explanation will suffice." The silence that followed was heavy with a new kind of friction. Emma wanted the ease of an apology, but his refusal to defend himself felt like a challenge to her own judgment. She later found a folder in the back of the filing cabinet. Old topographical maps with Dave's handwriting alongside annotations that mirrored Julian's modern strategy. The evidence was circumstantial, but in the sterile logic of her mind, it created a pattern she couldn't ignore. Their first real moment of intimacy by the river was shadowed by this unspoken wall. When Dave finally spoke, his voice was cold. "Trust is a choice, Emma. You're looking for a clinical trial to prove I'm loyal. But out here, you either stand with me or you don't. Decide which one it is." "I want to believe you," she whispered, eyes scanning the shadows cast by the trees. "But right now I don't know who to trust." Julian, unseen but omnipresent in her thoughts, had succeeded. The subtle manipulation, the drip feed of doubt, had planted the seed of mistrust. Emma felt herself at a crossroads. Rely on logic and investigation to uncover the truth, or succumb to the fear that threatened to poison the bond forming between her and Dave. The forest held its breath with her. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted, a reminder of the quiet patience that nature demanded and the urgent vigilance that human schemes required. The path forward would not be easy. Trust, once fractured, demanded proof. And proof, Emma realized, would come at the cost of risk, both to the reserve and to her fragile heart. As darkness fell, the Silver Stream Reserve seemed simultaneously safe and vulnerable, a mirror to her own conflicted emotions. And in that tension, the next moves of Julian, Dave, and Emma began to take shape. setting the stage for the battles, both internal and external, that would define the future of the land and the possibility of love amidst uncertainty. The dawn broke over the Silver Stream Reserve like a pale promise, but Emma felt none of its optimism. She sat at her father's old desk, staring at a series of high-priority alerts. Julian had bypassed the standard legal timeline by securing a preliminary injunction through an expedited court hearing, alleging immediate financial insolvency of the estate. The reserve's accounts were frozen under a temporary receivership, and a wave of corporate liens cascaded into her inbox, effectively paralyzing the operations of Silverstream within a matter of hours. Every transaction she attempted bounced back with an icy formality, each one a reminder that Julian's reach extended far beyond polite threats. She rubbed her temples, the weight of responsibility pressing down as if the mountains themselves had conspired against her. Dave entered the office quietly, his boots scuffing softly on the worn wooden floor. The tension between them from the previous day lingered, unspoken but palpable. He carried a sheaf of documents, flight logs, maintenance reports, and licenses, and handed them to her without a word. "They filed a complaint against my pilot's license," he said, voice low but edged with frustration, "alleging safety violations during transport of the Hawks. If they succeed, I'll never fly here again." Emma's stomach clenched. The stakes had shifted, and suddenly, the theoretical threats of yesterday became immediate and personal. Silverstream's survival depended not only on her finances, but also on Dave's ability to operate freely in the skies, to monitor wildlife, and to maintain the fragile balance of the ecosystem. Julian appeared at the reserve later that morning, his suit impeccably tailored, his expression the very definition of controlled confidence. He carried a folder under his arm, and his gaze swept the reserve as though it were a chessboard, and he already knew which pieces he intended to capture. "Emma," he began smoothly, as though their previous encounters had been nothing more than polite introductions, "I'm here to offer a solution." He opened the folder with a flourish. "Sign a lease for a portion of the land to our corporation, and all pending legal actions against you and Mr. Carter," he emphasized Dave's last name with precision, "will be withdrawn. No liens. No complaints. You keep the remainder of the reserve intact." Emma's heart thudded. It was a tempting offer, deceptively simple. Sign the lease, protect the reserve on paper, and survive financially. Yet the thought of compromising her father's legacy and the trust she had started to build with Dave burned in her chest. Dave's hands clenched at his sides. "Emma, you can't let him dictate our lives. This isn't protection, it's control. Once he owns even part of the land, everything we've fought for becomes his." The room felt smaller with the tension they carried. Emma's rational mind cataloged every consequence, every variable. If she refused, they faced financial ruin, the closure of the reserve, and Dave's career destroyed. If she agreed, she would betray her principles and perhaps the man she was beginning to care for more than she wanted to admit. Julian leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice into an almost conspiratorial murmur. "Think about it logically, Emma. Love for the land is admirable, but pragmatism secures survival. You don't have to risk everything to be noble." Emma swallowed, her chest tight. The trap Julian had set was elegant, emotional manipulation layered atop legal pressure. It was more than a test of courage. It was a test of judgment, loyalty, and the fragile trust she had begun to nurture with Dave. Dave stepped forward, placing a hand gently on her arm. "Emma, whatever you decide, we face it together. Don't let him split us apart with his threats. This is our home, and we protect it ourselves." Her mind raced as the words sank in. The wilderness outside seemed to echo with possibilities and dangers alike. Somewhere, the river flowed tirelessly, indifferent to human squabbles, yet sustaining life around it, much like the choices she now faced. Emma closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the quiet rustle of leaves, the distant caw of a crow, the wind through the pines. Every instinct screamed caution. Every memory of the resilience she had carried through trauma screamed determination. She would not be coerced. But the decision, how to fight, how to protect both the land and the man who had begun to matter more than she expected, loomed like a shadow over her heart. As Julian left with a smooth, self-satisfied nod, Emma turned to Dave, eyes burning with unspoken resolve. "We're not signing anything. Not without a plan. and I intend to find one. Dave's jaw relaxed slightly, though the worry remained. Together, they stepped outside into the crisp air of the reserve, the first true alliance formed under the pressure of corporate warfare. The battle had escalated from whispered threats to overt attacks. Now, every move mattered. The Silver Stream Reserve, once a quiet inheritance, had become a battlefield, legal, emotional, and ecological. And in the midst of it, Emma felt a strange thrill, the first real taste of agency, of courage, of the fight that would define both her legacy and her heart. Emma sat in the dim light of the reserve office, her fingers tracing the edges of the old maps spread across the desk. Each crease, each annotation, seemed to whisper secrets of a past she had only begun to understand. Julian's presence lingered like a shadow, even though he was miles away, his influence stretching through court filings, frozen accounts, and whispered rumors. The subtle manipulation, the strategic psychological pressure, it had worked, to a degree. She had doubted Dave, questioned his loyalty, allowed fear to cloud her judgment. But now, resolve settled in like a calm before a storm. She began her investigation, meticulously cross-referencing Julian's corporate filings with her father's financial documents. Every signature, every transaction, every loan notice was scanned, analyzed, and cataloged. Patterns emerged, inconsistencies jumped off the page, and a chilling picture formed. Julian had forged signatures, manipulated loans, and intentionally targeted the reserve for acquisition under the guise of corporate pragmatism. It wasn't just business, it was personal sabotage. Dave arrived quietly, carrying a worn satchel. His eyes flicked over the maps, catching the same annotations Emma had noticed. These markings, they matched the zones Julian would gain if the lease went through. Look at this, Emma. He's been planning this for months, using me, using us, to push you toward that deal. Emma's breath hitched, both from anger and relief. Anger at Julian, relief that Dave had been honest all along. The tension between them, the fracture caused by suspicion, began to mend as their understanding deepened. "We can't let him win," she said, voice low but firm. "But we have to be smart. One wrong move, and everything collapses." The next morning, Dave proposed a strategic alternative to a direct confrontation. Instead of a high-risk illegal flight that would jeopardize his license permanently, he provided Emma with precise topographic coordinates and flight path data he had gathered over years of observation. Following his guidance, Emma utilized the reserve's remaining emergency funds to commission an expedited, independent environmental audit from a certified federal laboratory. By hiring a neutral third party to conduct the aerial soil and water sampling, they ensured the resulting data would be legally airtight and immune to Julian's claims of bias or trespassing. Emma's analytical mind balanced the cost against the potential impact. It was a calculated investment in the truth that Julian could not easily dismiss. "This audit is our only clinical trial," Emma said, her voice gaining strength as she looked at the coordinates Dave had provided. "If we can get the certified results before Julian's injunction becomes permanent, we shift the entire burden of proof back onto the corporation." Dave nodded, a grim but determined smile touching his lips. "Then we move fast. I'll coordinate the ground access for the lab team while you handle the legal filing. We don't just defend anymore, we counterattack." Emma swallowed, her chest tight with fear and anticipation. She was willing. She had to be. Together, they began organizing their evidence, meticulously documenting every step, preparing for the confrontation that was inevitable. The following weeks were a high-stakes race against the clock. Emma's lawyers managed to secure a temporary stay on the receivership, citing the pending independent environmental audit as new evidence. This narrow window of legal breathing room culminated at the community's annual fundraiser. Julian arrived, exuding a predator's confidence, unaware that the weeks of preparation Emma had spent were not just for the party, but for his definitive exposure. His goal was clear: discredit Dave, undermine Emma, and force the lease through under social and legal pressure. Emma and Dave waited, a silent partnership strengthened by shared purpose. When Julian began his speech, subtly planting doubts about Dave's past with Terranex and framing the reserve as mismanaged, Emma stepped forward. The documents she had uncovered, the discrepancies in signatures, the proof of forged contracts, all were displayed before the assembled guests. The evidence was undeniable. Julian faltered, his composed exterior cracking as murmurs spread through the room. Dave added his testimony, explaining the aerial survey and presenting samples that clearly demonstrated the environmental dangers of the proposed industrial activity. The combination of legal proof and scientific evidence left the crowd stunned and silent. Julian's manipulation unraveled before their eyes. For Emma, the moment was a final validation of her transition from the sterile certainty of the ore to the complex grit of the reserve. She didn't rely on a dead man's switch or a phantom network. She relied on the undeniable weight of the independent audit and the communal resolve of the people standing behind her. The clarity that followed wasn't just about winning a legal battle. It was about the realization that her partnership with Dave had been forged in the fire of mutual scrutiny. He wasn't just a pilot with a complicated past. He was the anchor she had chosen through her own calculated judgment. By the end of the night, Julian maintained a facade of professional detachment, dismissing the evidence as a clerical misunderstanding before making a swift exit. However, the true defeat followed 48 hours later. Facing the risk of a massive public relations scandal and potential racketeering charges, the corporation issued a formal press release distancing themselves from Julian's unauthorized tactics and terminating his contract effective immediately. With the corporate giant withdrawing its claims to protect its own stock price, the legal cloud over Silver Stream finally dissipated, leaving the land in Emma's hands and Julian's reputation in ruins. As Emma and Dave walked back through the quiet trails, the forest alive with nocturnal sounds, they shared a look that spoke of more than relief. It was understanding, connection, and the first real taste of the partnership that might one day become something deeper. The shadow of doubt had lifted, replaced by resolve, trust, and the knowledge that together they could face whatever came next. The morning sun spilled gold across the Silver Stream Reserve, painting the mountains and river in warm light. Emma stood at the edge of the clearing, her hands resting on the railing of the observation deck she had helped restore with the community. The air smelled of pine, damp earth, and the faint hint of river water, an aroma that now felt like home. For the first time since inheriting the reserve, she could breathe freely, unburdened by uncertainty and fear. The past weeks had been a whirlwind of strategy, risk, and revelation. Julian's schemes had unraveled, the evidence Emma had meticulously gathered exposed his fraud, and the corporate challenge to the reserve had been withdrawn. Legal documents confirmed it. The reserve was hers, unencumbered, and Dave's pilot license had been reinstated thanks to testimonies from residents who had witnessed his dedication to both the wildlife and the community. Dave approached, carrying a small box of bird feed and tools for maintaining the feeders along the ridge trail. His eyes softened when they met hers, a mixture of relief, pride, and something unspoken lingering in the space between them. "You did it," he said quietly, setting the box down and brushing a hand over the railing beside her. "You didn't just save the reserve. You proved that the heart and mind together can accomplish what logic alone or courage alone could not." Emma smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that had been rare in recent months. "We did it," she corrected gently, her hand brushing his. "I couldn't have done any of it without you." For a long moment, they stood in silence, letting the sounds of the forest and river wash over them. The tension that had once divided them, the shadow of doubt, the fear of betrayal, the pressure of stakes too high to measure, had melted away, leaving a quiet understanding. They had confronted challenges together, balanced rationality with intuition, and emerged stronger for it. The community gathered later in the day for a small celebration, a symbolic acknowledgement of the reserve's continued existence and the bond between its caretakers and the land. Residents shared stories, laughter, and quiet gratitude. Emma realized that this was more than victory over a corporate adversary. It was a reaffirmation of human connection, trust, and shared responsibility. As dusk approached, Emma and Dave returned to the observation deck. The river below glimmered, and the peaks were bathed in the last amber rays of sunlight. She leaned against the railing, letting herself relax fully for the first time in months. "I've been thinking," Dave said, his voice low, careful, almost hesitant. "The reserve, it's more than land, more than a project. It's a life, and I want to share it with you, if you'll let me." Emma's chest tightened, a mixture of joy, relief, and a lingering residue of fear that had once held her back. She met his gaze and let herself smile, the rational part of her mind acknowledging the risks, and the emotional part embracing the possibility. "Yes," she whispered, her voice steady. "I want that too." Together, the mountains seemed to echo their affirmation, the forest alive with movement, the river singing its eternal song. The Silver Stream Reserve was no longer a battleground or a symbol of inheritance. It was their shared foundation, a testament to resilience, trust, and love. Later, as they walked along the restored trails, Emma reflected on how far she had come. Her line of fracture had been within herself, between fear and courage, between suspicion and trust. She had faced it, and in doing so, had discovered not only the strength to protect her father's legacy, but also the capacity to open her heart fully. Dave reached for her hand, and this time, she did not hesitate. The forest, the river, the mountains, they all bore witness to a new chapter, one built not on fear or obligation, but on choice, partnership, and hope. Together, they stepped forward, ready to embrace whatever future awaited them at Silver Stream.